us. The next presentation is by Emre Eldem. He is graduated from the Political Science Department of Gazi University. At the moment, he's a PhD student at Galatasaray University Political Science Department. His presentation will be on agricultural bank in distribution of abandoned properties in Izmir, studying on Anadolu newspaper between 1934-1936.
Merhaba. Merhaba.
Hello. Thank you. I would like to thank Hrant Dink Foundation for organizing this conference and inviting me to that conference. I'm grateful to them, and also I would like to thank everyone who contributed to this organization. This study is focusing on the abandoned properties in the revenue offices between 1934 and 1936, and I will try to follow these properties by using a newspaper, Anadolu newspaper. The important point is to find out what happened to those properties, on focusing especially on Izmir, and we try to find some clues in relation to who did what, who got the ownership of these properties. Agricultural bank had a share of that distribution, and the rest amount was secured in the trust accounts of the bank, and they served as the chain of the distribution cycle of the state. Many properties, lands, stores, houses, etc., they were distributed, and the property transfer and the distribution, this bank became one of the most important actors of this distribution. Some announcements were made on the Anadolu newspaper by the agricultural banks. So through some banks, especially public banks, it is possible to observe how this distribution of abandoned properties took place, and we can try to understand the role of the abandoned properties in this era. First, we need to look at the laws in relation to those properties. When we look at the laws and regulations, we can follow the dimension of this transfer. So the legal basis needs to be traced. We need to take those into consideration in order not to leave that issue half. In the Greek in Anatolia and Turks in Greece, for the population exchange of these people, the two states made a contract, and the protocol identified the conditions of the population exchange. And in relation to the properties, 1930 June dated Ankara contract identifies the conditions for the properties between the Turkish government and Greek government. This Ankara contract, Ankara agreement signed between the two governments. Sorry for my misspelling of the word. How the treasury gained the property. And this is as follows. According to the second article of the Ankara agreement, the movable and immovable properties of the Greek population, these properties' ownership is transferred to the Turkish government. And according to the 8th article, those who are who are exempt from the population exchange, the ownership of the properties owned by the Greek subjects is assumed by the Turkish government, especially those who are located in Izmir. So all these movable and immovable properties ownerships is transferred to Turkish state. After giving this pre-information, let me give you some brief information about the newspaper that we will be examining. These announcements, especially the ones that will be distributed, that will be liquidated by the agricultural bank. The newspaper is selected for that purpose is Anadolu newspaper. In terms of the years, I see that this newspaper was established in 1910. This newspaper is a daily newspaper, and during the period that I examined, and the period that I went into detail was between 1934 and 1936. Through that local newspaper, I looked at the properties that are liquidated by the agricultural bank. And when we link it to the agricultural bank, this process of liquidation, the reason why this bank has responsibility for this issue, it is not related to it being a public bank, but also it is related that the bank has given the legal authority for this issue. And 1925 dated article, for instance, law of article says that gives some details in relation to how much money with how much interest rate to which bank the money for the liquidation of the property be paid, and the bank named here is Agricultural Bank.
Emanet hesaplarına yatırıldığını görüyoruz.
And the money that is accumulated in the bank is also transferred as an income to the yearly budget of the state. Let me ask this question, whether Izmir is an exception in this case or not. We can see this through the codes of those who were interested in the abandoned properties. It is assumed that the value of the property that will be liquidated in Izmir is 4 million. And around Izmir, the amount will be 2.5 million. So this gives us an idea about the volume of the property that will be liquidated in and around Izmir. Another important example here is in April 1, 1928 regulation, Article 12 of that says that Ministry of Finance says that the sale, the follow-up of the properties in question will be done by Agricultural Bank, and there will be a 1% commission to the bank. So this shows us that there is also trust accounts, and also there is a commission received by the bank. We see that. When we look at the announcements given by the Agricultural Bank in 2 years' time, we see that 1,048 properties. It's a very high number, actually. And when we look at the importance of Izmir before and after that era, we can say that this figure is a quite high figure. And when we look at the functionalities of those properties that are liquidated, that bring us to important consequences. The houses is 30% of the whole. The commercial and industrial properties it is 60% of it, and this is the majority of the properties that are liquidated, and the rest 8% is agricultural properties. And this shows us that agricultural bank liquidated properties says that these are mostly urban properties, and when we look at in a more detailed fashion, we can separate them by the ones that are sold and given to rent. 10% is given for rent, and a great majority is out for sale. And this situation, when we come to the end of 1936, the number of properties sold by the agricultural bank is reduced because they have a limited number of properties left in their hands. When we look at the data and try to separate it according to the districts, Konak has a 21% share and holds the first degree. Bayraklı is 18%. Buca has 17%. Bornova has 13%, and Karşıyaka has a 9% share in the total. And with the data that we have, we see that this corresponds to the 80% of the whole data, and we know that there are small percentages of properties that are located in Torbalı and other outer districts of Izmir, and the properties that are liquidified outside of the city, the percentage of those is very limited. Let me repeat that. March 1929, this is the news in the newspaper. Although the population exchange agreement is signed, this news tells us that there are some ongoing problems. The properties that are located outside of Istanbul are transferred to agricultural bank, and the bank started to deal with those properties, and again excluding Istanbul properties belonging to Greek population. It was transferred to bond in 1929. This is important because the agreement, this regulation, was announced and signed in 1928, and it shows us that this process is finished, terminated in 1929. The same information is confirmed by a news appearing on the Adana local newspaper. It also mentions that this transferal procedures have not been completed yet, and a question arises here. If in 1929 this transfer occurred, why from those dates they did not start to liquidate those properties? This is the Cumhuriyet newspaper from 1931. It says that the Greek property value in Turkey is equal to 7 million, which will be sold with auction. This shows us that those properties out for sale were not sold yet. Again, Akşam newspapers issue from 1932 again talks about selling of those properties in return for bonds.
Gidermeye çalıştıktan sonra
After trying to remedy this uncertainty, in 1934 we see these immovable property. We see that liquidation of this immovable property started. Actually, these announcements were published almost every week, and you see these were published in local papers. And when these immovable properties were offered for sale, they made certain announcements and explanations. When we look at here, They say that these properties would be sold in consideration of bonds or cash. So we see that these bonds were used as a valid unit for sale of this immovable property. And there's also an interesting announcement. So 3 banks were liquidated through agricultural bank, and in Izmir 17 banks were liquidated because Izmir is much more industrialized compared to other provinces. And in the presentation that was made before me, it says that in 1914 there were 120 plants in Izmir, in the city, and therefore this is quite important. It's possible to say that it's quite important. And when we look at these plants, excluding one of them, all of them were offered for sale, and only one of them was rented. But I want to say something else here. And Armenian and Greek terms could substitute each other. And in some texts they were referring to Greeks, and in some texts they refer to Armenians. And we see that they were using Greek of Turkish nationality and also Greeks. And there's also interesting about this announcement. We see that most of this immovable property was land, pieces of land, and this corresponded to a very high percentage. And 349 lands were transferred during this liquidation. And after the fire in 1922, a destruction occurred, and we can say that this was a manifestation of this destruction. 2.6 million square meter and 25,000 houses, churches, hotels, cafes were destroyed as a result of this fire. So we are not surprising that the most of the property that was being sold was pieces of lands. And so we can see similar examples in these announcements, but I want to underline the following. So as a memory of the city, as part of the city memory, the street names were changed, and we see that street names were Turkified, and so the streets were given names. For instance, Cevat Tayyar, Namık Kemal, Tevfik Fikret. So prominent Turkish figures, names of them were given to these streets, and also there were names which remembered the independence war, and so they have erased the city memory by changing the location names. And we see we see an announcement for renting a place. And when we look at immovable property which was rented, this was a residential property, and compared to the commercial properties, we said that their number was higher. The number of residences that was rented was 56, but the number of rented commercial places was 39. And when we look at the rented immovable property, there is another announcement. So the single plant which was rented was the lumber plant and timber plant, and out of the Izmir city center in other areas properties were also offered for sale. For instance, you see this announcement. It is for the sale of an immovable property located in Ödemiş, and you see that the immovable properties liquidated by the agricultural bank were not only located at the city center, as this announcement proves us. And also I want to say something else. Agricultural bank was not the only state bank which liquidated these properties. There was also Emlak and Eytan Bank. So it also liquidated 1/3 of the immovable properties. And particularly beautiful Izmir and its periphery. So it's quite interesting that it writes here that he has assisted greatly to the reconstruction of beautiful Izmir, which was destroyed with the fire. And in Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir and Adana, we see that the bank was liquidating these immovable properties. And here you see the number. You see that many pieces of land were sold in Izmir through this bank, and apart from that, in Emlak and Eytan Bank also sold residential areas, commercial and industrial areas, and this industrial and commercial property constitutes almost the half of the total properties that was sold. So the government acted through state banks, including agricultural bank. The fire destroyed three-quarters of the city, and we can see this in the liquidation process. So these immovable properties were not only liquidated through agricultural bank, as I said earlier, other banks, other state banks were also used, but the share of Emlak and Eytan Bank was much limited in this liquidation process, and we see that agricultural bank held the main power. And when we bring together other state banks, in total many properties were sold, and almost half of it was commercial and industrial premises, and we see that the ownership was transferred. So these were used to create a local bourgeoisie, and I would like to end my presentation with a quote from Fali Rıfkı. And non-Muslim Izmir burnt down as a result of the fire, and who were responsible for this fire? Were they Armenians? And there are also many people who say that Hayri Nurettin Pasha did this. Why did we burn down Izmir? So were we afraid that we would not get rid of the non-Muslims if the Hotas on the Cordolia stayed? And we see that we have burned down many places with this fear. So I think there is a. I think this is also related to our inferiority, feeling of inferiority.